So in the 1950s, Japan was generally ruled by a very successful Prime Minister, Yoshida Shigeru, and he's compared to Winston Churchill, who was a very successful Prime Minister in Britain around the same time. Yoshida was very conservative, but he was pro American, pro US in his outlook, which means he was very useful for the Americans to have this kind of an ally in Japan. And more importantly, he was anti communist. Okay, at this time, the world is in the middle of the Cold War between the capitalist and the communist blocs. And Japan, who is a staunch American ally, is part of the American anti communist capitalist bloc. So Yoshida Shigeru was a great person, being an anti communist who wanted to keep Japan away from communism and to be a democratic nation. Yoshida's political party that he belonged to was known as the Liberal Democratic Party, and we use the term liberal here, but it's not really a liberal party. It's actually a very conservative political party, and it was the most popular political party. In fact, for the majority of Japan's post-war history, with the exceptions of only a few years, the Liberal Democratic Party has been the political party in power. And the opposition party at that time was the Japan Socialist Party, the JSP, who were the main opposition party in the Diet, and of course they were allowed very freely to organize and have political and have political activity because again we're not living in a dictatorship anymore, but still it was much smaller. And the Japanese Communist Party, even though Japan is a very staunch pro-American, anti-communist ally, because the country is now democratic, the Japan Communist Party is allowed to participate as well. So even though America was responsible for Japan's defense, Prime Minister Yoshida knew this wasn't enough because if there was ever a major war and the United States was not able to defend Japan, what was going to happen? The country should at least be able to defend itself, right? So Yoshida asks the Americans for permission to form basically a National Guard or police reserve type of organization that will be responsible for national security and self-defense. They can't start war, they cannot participate in war, they cannot declare war. Their purpose is to A, be there if the country is ever invaded and just to be defending themselves in the event of an emergency. And also, if there's ever a natural disaster, they'll be the ones deployed to help out, kind of like our National Guard. So the United States agrees with this, and the self-defense forces are created. And this SDF, or the self-defense forces, and at that time they consisted of 75,000 men. They've gotten bigger since then, but that's how Japan was able to get a quote-unquote army purely for self-defense. And like I mentioned, since Japan, officially according to the Constitution, is a pacifist nation, self-defense forces cannot go to war. Okay, they can only engage in self-defense, okay, peacekeeping, and humanitarian operations. So they're not allowed to participate in battle. And this was tested in 1950 when the Korean War started. North Korea invades South Korea, and the United States is in the middle of another war just 5 years after World War II ended. So, what role does Japan have in the Korean War? Well, nothing. Okay, remember that according to the new constitution, Japan is not allowed to contribute any troops or participate in any fighting. So they think that what can we do to help the Americans another way? Okay, since we're a pacifist nation, we can't do any fighting. What can we do? Well, through the industrial factories that were restarted right after the war, Japan supplies the American army with tons of supplies, tons of military parts. Okay, and not only does this help the United States because Japan is creating and manufacturing all these goods for them. This also jump-started Japan's national economy right after the war. The Japanese economy had been devastated from World War II. It needed a little kick, and this was the perfect kick to jumpstart Japan's national economy by supplying all these military parts to the United States. And we can really thank Prime Minister Yoshida for this because his goal was to expand Japan's economy and industrial development. Okay, and he said, you know what? Even though I'm a conservative, I'm going to have the government fund these companies, fund these factories, because if the government funds the factories and the factories become big and successful, the economy is going to go back to where it was before. Okay, and Yoshida's plan of funding the government funding of factories and companies worked because by the end of the 1950s, the Japanese gross national product expanded by 10% annually. Every single year it expanded by 10%. That's a huge achievement. The economy got better than it had ever been ever before. And that's how the Japanese economy becomes a powerhouse by the beginning of the 1960s, thanks to Prime Minister Yoshida's policies of funding the factories. In 1956, Japan was admitted to the United Nations officially, and the Japanese flag was raised outside the UN headquarters, as you can see in the picture there. The ruling conservative Liberal Democratic Party was very pro American in their outlook. So in the 1950s, the Japanese government's policies were very pro US and usually were one and the same. The Japanese would make sure they would have the same policies as the United States. In 1960, there was a little problem because the new prime minister, Kishi Nobusuke, signed a pact called the Mutual Security Treaty with President Eisenhower. And in this pact, it states the United States promised to protect Japan militarily in the event of any threat from China, which was by this time a communist dictatorship, and the Soviet Union. In other words, if those two countries, which were so close to Japan, threatened them, the Americans promised that they would keep Japan safe and ensure that it was a capitalist nation. So Prime Minister Kishi and Eisenhower signed the pact, but many of members, especially youth, Japanese socialists and communists, oppose the pact because they're communists, so they don't want the Americans to help Japan stay capitalist. They want Japan to become communist. Okay? In addition, they didn't like the American military presence in Japan. They said, we're no longer occupied. Why are there so many troops here? So in 1960, there was a huge student demonstration in Tokyo outside of the Diet Building. Socialists and communists participated. Um, you know, free speech was allowed now, and people were allowed to assemble and demonstrate, but things got violent. So the police had to get involved, and a young girl was killed, and things got a little violent for the first time since the end of the war because of this demonstration. And as a result, Prime Minister Kishi was very embarrassed. He resigned, and President Eisenhower, who was supposed to visit Japan in 1960, had to cancel the trip. Okay, but at the end of the day, the pact stayed in place. It's been renewed, and the crisis eventually died down without any further incident. Okay, and this doesn't mean that the Japanese people didn't like the Americans. Today, even today, the government and the people generally are very supportive of the United States and their policies. Most of the time, even if there are some disagreements, it's generally positive. The 1960s through the 80s are all about the economy. Okay, the Japanese GDP, the gross domestic product, tripled within 3 decades. And because of this beautiful economic situation, a city dwelling middle class is born. Okay, you have people who live in the cities. They're not very rich, they're not poor, but they're comfortable. Okay, they enjoy and they can afford whatever they want. Electronics start to boom during this time. People can afford the electronics because of the economy. It's so good. And by this time, Japan, just 20 years after less than 20 years after the war ends, it becomes first the third largest economic power in the world, and eventually the second largest world economic power. A huge achievement for a country that was just devastated by war a few years before. And in 1962, Tokyo hosts the Summer Olympic Games, and this was the final straw for the economy. It gets really, really good because, when you host the Olympic Games, it's perfect for your economy, right? And not only that, it was symbolic because this was a way for Japan to invite the world, right, every other country in the world, to Japan and say, you know what, we're back, we're peaceful, we're friends, and we've recovered. Just 19 years after the end of World War II, we've recovered, we're back into the world arena. So it was a great thing to show that Japan was back. And now that things are better with the United States, Japan also had to patch things up with its old friends, its Asian neighbors. So in 1965, 1 year after the Olympics, Japan restores formal diplomatic relations with South Korea. And in 1972, around the same time as the United States and Communist China having diplomatic relations inaugurated, Japan also follows suit and restores diplomatic relations with Communist China. So Japan really tries to make friends again with its Asian neighbors, although Unfortunately, it has not yet apologized formally for issues like the rape of Nanking that I talked about during World War II in China or the colonial period in Korea. These are still things that are being discussed, but things have gotten better over the years. And so, thanks to Japan's huge economic growth throughout the 70s and the 80s, we see a new market for the first time: tourism. Okay, tourism to Japan increases. Um, People want to go to Japan and visit because it's back to normal. It's a peaceful country again. And also, people all over the world begin to study Japanese. Because of the economic success, people believe that, oh, if I want to learn the language of the future, I have to learn Japanese. So, this is kind of the history of Japanese language education around the world. It was around this time that people started to learn Japanese, take Japanese language classes, etc.